the 84th episode in our AI and You podcast series. Today is Monday, February 7th, 2022, and I'm your host, Vicar Saidi. I'm a computer scientist and engineer, a lecturer and a consultant. I'm also the author of several books. My most recent book is about artificial intelligence and is titled The Genome Affair. The Genome Affair is a speculative work. It examines what the world might be like if some of the more extraordinary capabilities forecast to be realized in AI over the next 20 to 30 years were actually realized today. Given the growing list of frightening existential threats humankind now faces, the book pays particular attention to the impact AI is expected to have on world affairs. The book is available in ebook format for those who prefer to read on a digital device, but it's also available in a high-quality paperback edition. The Genome Affair is available on Amazon, so I hope you'll take the time to read it and to leave a review. Amazon book reviews are very helpful for writers. I'm very interested in how science and technology influence world affairs and the big questions facing humankind, studying at the confluence of the great disciplines of human history, political science and thought, international affairs, science and technology, offers a deep understanding and pedagogically important lessons of how advances in human endeavor have influenced and impacted civilization. I'm available to give talks on artificial intelligence and its related technologies, and on the impact AI is expected to have, or is already having, on our world. If you'd like to get in touch with me to arrange a web-based event or consulting meeting with your company or organization, you can find my contact info in the podcast notes below. Please make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and share it with others if you find the content valuable. Thank you. And now, on to today's podcast. In our last podcast, episode 83, I spoke about whether protein folding is our most important achievement in AI so far. In today's podcast, episode 84, I'll speak about artificial intelligence and 21st century military doctrine. Let's get started. As Russia firms its plans for what now appears to be an imminent invasion in the Ukraine, perhaps as early as mid-February, it's insightful to examine how this situation might compare to the situation some decades ago, on the eve of the Japanese surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet, then stationed at Pearl Harbor. On that Sunday morning, in just under 2 hours, a Japanese formation of 30 ships, 12,000 men, and 300 aircraft had managed the meticulous execution of an improbable mission that rendered the U.S. Pacific Fleet essentially incapacitated, if only temporarily. In the words of some Japanese military officials soon after the attack, it was a tactical success, but a strategic failure. But how might things have been different if either or both sides had the benefit of military-grade AI, as may now be the case in the pending Russia-Ukraine conflict? Prior to the opening of imminent hostilities in various Ukrainian theaters of war, the Russian military will know how many troops are present on the battlefield, the accuracy, lethality, location, quantity, and type of military hardware arrayed against them, the signaling and communications protocols and systems employed by Ukrainian troops, and a detailed dynamic mapping and surveillance of defensive and offensive strategies, tactics, terrain, and troop movements. With help from Western allies, the Ukrainians may have similar intelligence capabilities. Significant portions of these capabilities will be enabled by artificial intelligence agents capable of processing seemingly infinite volumes of data at near instantaneous speed and with a high degree of accuracy. Such battlefield military capability is a new chapter in a rapidly evolving 21st century doctrine of war, and validating these capabilities is an important, if not key objective, of Russia's pending invasion into Ukraine. On December 7, 2021, we commemorated the 80th anniversary of the surprise Japanese attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet, then stationed at Pearl Harbor, on the southern coast of the island of Oahu in the Hawaiian archipelago. The anniversary offers a unique opportunity for reflection upon that day and the months and years leading up to it. What happened? Why and how today's technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, might have altered the outcome of what President Roosevelt had appropriately termed a day that will live in infamy. As a proxy for human intelligence, artificial intelligence is increasingly being employed in the theater of war. With each passing day, AI's capabilities to improve and increase the analysis, precision, quality, and volume of intelligence gathering of the activities and planning of one's enemies in advance of expected military conflict, as well as battlefield intelligence and knowledge once hostilities have begun, is unprecedented. As was the case with the technologies of the first industrial revolution, and every industrial revolution thereafter, the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution are being effectively employed in a destructive, dystopian manner. In the period leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan had been at war with China and had claimed sovereignty over Manchuria in the far northeast of the country. The United States government was willing to recognize Japanese sovereignty over Manchuria if the Japanese would withdraw from other parts of China. But with 1 million Japanese soldiers already deployed to the Chinese mainland, and having been at war there since 1937, the Japanese were not willing to abandon their investment or hard-won gains. They wanted to conquer even more of the country. As a series of islands off the east coast of Asia, Japan was not self-sufficient in its domestic need for resources, let alone the resources needed to prosecute war in theaters as large as China or Southeast Asia. So with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party's conquest unfolding in Western Europe, Japan realized that the British colonies in Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore, the Dutch colonies in the East Indies, Indonesia, the French colonies in Indochina, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, and the American colony in the Philippines were all vulnerable. For all intents and purposes, these lands were defenseless. The American and European colonial territories were now essentially orphan nations, as their colonial masters were busy with Nazi occupation of their own homeland, or with naval conflict in the Atlantic. During the years leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military, with its roots in ancient samurai culture, had brought down the nation's civilian parliamentary democracy, which had been led by Western-educated Japanese politicians and technocrats. Since the times of feudal Japan, the military did not report to a civilian government. Rather, they reported to Japan's emperor. Together, the emperor and military wanted to drive the Americans and Europeans out of East and Southeast Asia so they could establish their own imperial rule. They believed Asia was for Asians, and that conquest of the soon-to-be former European colonies would enable them to secure an abundant and steady supply of coal, oil, rubber, tin, and many other commodities necessary to power their new industrial economy and territorial ambitions. Thus, on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, at 7:53 a.m., 30,000 U.S. military personnel stationed at the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor were stirred from their slumber by a Japanese surprise air attack. Given the rapidly deteriorating political climate between the two countries, everyone in America expected that they would soon be at war with Japan. But no one, not even husband Kimmel, the new Navy admiral responsible for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, now permanently stationed in Hawaii, expected such an attack. It was a complete surprise, as reported by the first Japanese bomber pilots, as they broke through the early morning clouds high above the harbor and announced into the mouthpiece of their headsets, "Tora, Tora, Tora," "Tiger, Tiger, Tiger," indicating in code to their Operation Command and Control Center, 220 miles out at sea, that they had achieved their key objective, the element of surprise. Nearly the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet was in harbor that morning, neatly aligned for the imminent torpedo and bombing raid that would soon wreak havoc and devastation for the next 2 hours over the defenseless and sleepy harbor and naval base. Japan's Admiral Yamamoto had meticulously designed the high-risk plan to attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, and the execution of the plan was delegated to Admiral Nagumo. He would be charged with carrying out the precarious mission to destroy the Pacific Fleet. Nagumo would lead the entire Japanese Navy, 30 ships, including all 6 aircraft carriers, and over 400 aircraft on this top-secret mission. Once the attack began, Nagumo launched 300 aircraft in 2 waves. They first attacked the airfields where all planes had been marshaled so they could be protected from sabotage by Japanese residents on the islands. The Japanese planes then turned their firepower on the neatly arranged ships in the harbor. Once their mission was complete, of the 300 aircraft Nagumo sent to drop bombs and torpedoes, 271 Japanese planes returned to their carriers, idling 220 miles north of Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was normally spread between the U.S. Navy's ports at Long Beach, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Seattle, but had been deployed to Pearl Harbor for joint training. A decision was then taken by President Roosevelt to permanently station the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, about 12 miles from Honolulu, to serve as a warning, in effect, a loaded gun pointed at the Japanese. Against an outcry from Admiral Richardson, the U.S. Pacific Fleet's current commander, President Roosevelt insisted that the Navy's ships remain there as a deterrent. A volley of strong objections and an exchange of harsh words led to the dismissal of Admiral Richardson and the appointments of Admiral husband Kimmel. Kimmel would now oversee the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. Fortunately, some ships from the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been moved to the Atlantic Fleet to support America's European allies in their Atlantic conflict with the Nazis. Still more fortunately, all 3 of America's new aircraft carriers were out at sea, and thus unscathed by the December 7th assault. Nevertheless, 328 American aircraft were destroyed, whilst 19 ships were severely damaged, and 2,403 servicemen were killed. In the single worst incident that morning, the forward ammunition magazine of the battleship USS Arizona was hit during the assault, resulting in the death of over 1,100 sailors. U.S. Army General Short has been tasked with guarding the base surrounding the harbor and its numerous military assets. Since the Japanese were the largest minority group living in Hawaii, General Short feared they might sabotage the planes and other military assets on the base, so he issued an order to lock all anti-aircraft ammunition safely away. Short then ordered all planes placed in clear sight on the tarmac, so they could be best protected from elements of subterfuge. Short never expected an attack from the air, and so the men on the base were essentially defenseless once Admiral Nagumo's air assault began. Most exposed planes were destroyed, and the American servicemen had no anti-aircraft ammunition to fight back against the waves of Japanese bombers and machine gunners. Approximately 1/2 hour before bombing began at 7:53 a.m., Admiral Kimmel received notice that the U.S. Navy had neutralized a Japanese midget submarine just outside Pearl Harbor using a depth charge. But Kimmel didn't believe the report. It didn't make sense to him. He thought it was probably an erroneous report, and so he ignored it. A little while later, Admiral Nagumo and Yamamoto learned from the Japanese pilots that all 3 American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor during the assault. These carriers were a critical target along with the 8 American battleships, which were in harbor and thus targeted. Yamamoto understood that missing the carriers was a major failure of the mission, although most others still considered it a success. The Japanese planners also assumed the Pearl Harbor attack would serve to demoralize the American society. But they were wrong. The attack had had the opposite effect. Given the immense volumes of data generated by satellites and many other modalities of intelligence data gathering today, it's difficult for humans to monitor, process, and extract actionable, meaningful intelligence. But with artificial intelligence, there's little doubt that a surprise attack, such as the one realized at Pearl Harbor, would not have been possible. In fact, if the Japanese had known that America's aircraft carriers were not there, it is very unlikely that Admiral Yamamoto would have authorized the December 7th strike to proceed. No one in the Japanese Naval Intelligence Service had any idea of what might be in the harbor that morning. They simply had no way of knowing, so they could only hope for the best. But with the sophistication of satellite imagery and AI-enabled intelligence gathering and processing today, the Japanese would have known what was there and where the missing aircraft carriers were as well. Further, General Short would have known through communications surveillance that there was a Japanese naval officer stationed in Oahu that was a spy. This naval officer could have been neutralized and the threat he posed eliminated. Through AI-enabled communications surveillance, General Short would also have known that his fears regarding the loyalty of Japanese citizens on the island were misplaced. As such, he wouldn't have placed all the aircraft on the tarmac, where they then became prime targets for Japanese bombers. Just after 7 a.m. on the morning of the attack, radar intelligence from the northern tip of the island had spotted a mass which they understood to be a large aircraft formation approaching from the north. But the early stage of radar technology at the time left officials confused. They assumed that the planes were American Navy aircraft. Today, AI-enabled automated surveillance would immediately have recognized these aircraft by their distinct characteristics and signatures relative to U.S. military aircraft, and would have alerted commanders that enemy aircraft were approaching. Today, with a staggering volume of data from satellites and numerous other sources, we have more data than any human or group of humans could possibly process and screen for military or politically important value. But with artificial intelligence, these constant, enormous, and near limitless volumes can be processed by AI agents who experience no fatigue as they work around the clock to uncover signals of military and political significance and value. With the use of contemporary technology, and AI in particular, the Japanese attack and subsequent attacks may have been planned very differently. Instead of 12,000 sailors, officers, and pilots, perhaps only a fraction would have been required, whilst the rest could have been deployed in Manchuria and South Korea, where Japan was actively engaged in military confrontation. Today, aircraft are increasingly automated, with pilots serving in a monitoring and exception processing role. Planes can also be controlled remotely if necessary, and weapons systems can be controlled and monitored in a similar manner. Reconnaissance can be performed to quickly determine whether objectives have been achieved or whether follow-up targeting is required. The conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians in May of 2021, a mission dubbed Operation Guardian of the Wall by the Israeli military, may have been the precursor of what future warfare enabled by artificial intelligence might look like. This military engagement was the first time that AI took its place as the central component in the command and control apparatus of the Israeli Defense Force. We may see similar reports from Ukraine in the very near future. Voluminous data gathered about Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the Gaza Strip during the 2 years preceding Operation Guardian of the Walls was thoroughly analyzed by Israeli artificial intelligence. Commercially available AI technology was adapted by the Israeli military into an AI agent that could extract intelligence in preparation for and during this conflict. A series of interdisciplinary AI algorithms, codenamed Alchemist, Gospel, and Depth of Wisdom, aggregated and processed data gathered from geographic, human, signal, and visual means to support IDF military operations in Gaza during the 11-day incursion. During this time, the AI systems recommended hundreds of defensive and offensive strike targets to the IDF. Israeli military commanders have argued that AI-enabled intelligence gathering from satellites and other sources helped them shorten the duration of the engagement due to the rapid determination of key targets. Israel's militarization of commercially available AI enabled the IDF to quickly launch hundreds of strikes against Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad's rocket launch, manufacturing, and storage sites, military intelligence centers, drones, personal residences of military commanders, as well as Hamas's naval commando unit. This resulted in the destruction of most of the naval commando unit's infrastructure and weapons system, including some of their autonomous GPS-guided submarines that were capable of carrying substantial amounts of explosives. Israel's advanced artificial intelligence capabilities were used by the IDF to process staggering volumes of data that military intelligence intercepts and collects from Gaza on a daily basis, including telephone calls, text messages, surveillance camera footage, satellite images, and a vast array of sensors in order to turn them into actionable intelligence. For example, where might a Hamas commander likely be found at a specific time? To gain a sense of scale of the amount of data being collected and processed by the AI agents, the IDF said it estimates that during the course of the conflict, any given point in the Gaza Strip was photographed at least 10 times each day. Hamas's underground tunnel network, known as the Metro by the Israeli military, was also heavily damaged by airstrikes during the course of the conflict. IDF sources say they were able to map the network, consisting of hundreds of kilometers of tunnels deep under residential areas, to a nearly intimate degree. There was little that they did not understand about these networks. The mapping of the metro was done using advancements in the use of big data to merge all the information into a cohesive and comprehensive understanding from which intelligence could then be extracted. Through this method, the IDF obtained a clear picture of the tunnel network, both above and below ground, including details such as depth, thickness, and the orientation of the routes. Military planners and strategists then used this picture to construct an attack plan for the tunnel assault operation. The IDF acknowledges that the operation did not result in the destruction of the entire network. In fact, perhaps only 1/3 of the tunnel was destroyed, but nevertheless they believe that the degree of damage sustained is such that the network is no longer usable. Another AI agent deployed in the conflict, and known by the IDF as the Alchemist, alerted troops in the field to possible anti-tank attacks by Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. One IDF officer did die in the conflict, but the AI agent probably saved many more from Palestinian anti-tank firepower directed at them. The conflict offers a sense of just how powerful AI already is, and its efficacy and potency are likely to only increase with the passage of time. Russia's pending assault in the Ukraine will likely give us many new and perhaps unsettling insights. Thank you for spending some time with me. I'm trying to follow the TED Talk format, and so I'm keeping these podcasts generally under 20 minutes. Let me know what you think. I hope you'll find these insights into artificial intelligence helpful, and I hope you'll read my new book, The Genome Affair. It's on Amazon. Until next time then, this has been the AI and You podcast with author Vicar Saidi.